Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is fight for lives everyone else has already written off. In a world where cruelty often finds its way into the shadows, one police officer's act of defiance would change everything. In the small American town of Rustwood, an auction was selling off two starving retired K9 dogs to the highest bidder. Most folks saw them as dangerous, broken tools, no longer fit to serve, and better off forgotten. But when Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward and declared he would buy them at any cost, the crowd erupted in disbelief. They thought he had lost his mind, throwing away his future for two dying animals. Daniel had his reasons, though. Years ago, he had lost a loyal K9 partner in the line of duty, and he had carried that wound ever since. These two broken dogs might be his chance at redemption. Taking them home would stir anger among his neighbors and pressure from his own sheriff, who feared the animals would turn on the town. But what Daniel didn't know was that these dogs were tied to a darker scheme, a ruthless traitor who sold former K9s into bloodsport and crime. Saving them would pull Daniel into a storm that tested not only his courage but his very soul. Would his decision to save Rex and Duke bring healing, or would it destroy everything he had worked to rebuild? Before we jump into the full story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you. Amen. The autumn wind blew cold through the small frontier town of Rustwood, a farming and ranching community that looked worn at the edges. The morning had started gray, clouds heavy and low, turning the streets into long strips of shadow. Market day always brought more people than usual. Farmers bringing livestock, families from the outlying hills looking for supplies, traders setting up stalls that smelled of tobacco, leather, and fried bread. It was noisy, messy, a place where business and gossip intertwined. On this particular Saturday, however, a yellow banner stretched across the square with bold black letters, "Auction Today." It promised bargains and curiosities, though the air carried an unease that Daniel Brooks couldn't quite ignore. Daniel Brooks was a man of 38, tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of posture that came from years of training in both the academy and patrol. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished though dulled by years of use, his dark hair cut short with faint silver at the temples. He carried himself with a quiet gravity, his gray-blue eyes always scanning, weighing, reading people. Beneath that composed surface lay the private scars of a man who had lost more than he cared to speak about. Years ago, he'd worked side by side with a K9 named Shadow, a German shepherd who had been his partner and closest friend. Shadow had died protecting him during a warehouse raid, and Daniel still carried the guilt, tucked into the folds of memory. That grief made him wary of ever allowing another dog close, yet it also meant he could never ignore cruelty when he saw it. The fairground square was crowded, dust swirling beneath boots and hooves, the smell of hay and sweat mixing with roasted nuts. Daniel wasn't planning on stopping. His goal had been routine patrol, making sure fights didn't break out when whiskey mixed with temper. But the sound of barking stopped him cold. Not the playful yaps of farm dogs, but the hoarse, ragged noise of animals who had barked themselves raw. He turned his head, and his eyes narrowed. At the far end of the square, next to a covered wagon, stood Cole Maddox. Cole was in his early 40s, tall but lean, his frame wiry like a whip. His hair was slicked back with oil, dark as coal, and his mustache was trimmed thin over a sharp mouth that rarely smiled without cruelty behind it. He wore a brown pinstripe coat, polished boots, and carried himself like a man who thought of himself as important. But it was his eyes that betrayed him, cold, calculating, a predator in human form. Cole Maddox was known in hushed whispers as a trader who never asked questions about where animals came from nor where they went. To him, life was merchandise, and if the law turned a blind eye, it was because Maddox knew how to pay the right people. Behind him were two cages of iron, and in one of them lay the reason Daniel's boots rooted to the ground. Inside huddled two German shepherds, their coats dull and matted, ribs visible through thin fur. One, larger with a scar across his muzzle, lifted his head and fixed Daniel with amber eyes that burned despite the weakness in his body. The other, slightly smaller, pressed close against the bars, tongue lolling, panting as though each breath took effort. Their collars were nothing but chains looped cruelly around their necks. They were underfed, thirsty, but their gaze was alert soldiers stripped of dignity, still clinging to pride. Daniel knew that look. He had seen it in Shadow's eyes in the last minutes before death. Maddox raised his hands to call the crowd to attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, trained to command attention like a carnival barker. "Today I bring you something rare, something valuable. Not cattle, not hogs, but warriors. Retired K9s, trained by the very police force of this nation. What you see here are two fine dogs, strong, obedient, and ready to serve a new master." A murmur swept the crowd. Farmers shifted uneasily. Children tried to peer closer. A few rough men near the front grinned, men who Daniel recognized as drifters, gamblers, maybe even men who fought dogs for money. The sight turned his stomach. Standing nearby was Sheriff Howard Briggs, Rustwood's lawman in his late 50s. Howard had the build of a bull, short and solid, with weathered skin, square jaw, and a mustache more salt than pepper. He wore his tan sheriff's coat unbuttoned, a Colt holstered at his side, and his expression was carved into permanent suspicion. Briggs was a fair man, but cautious to the point of stubbornness. He distrusted anything that might upset the fragile peace of his town. Years ago, his younger brother had been mauled by a stray dog, leaving him with a limp. That memory had hardened Briggs into a man who believed animals could never be fully trusted. He watched Maddox with a wary frown, but didn't move to stop the auction. To Briggs, they were just dogs. Maddox tapped the cage. The dogs growled faintly, though too weak to sound truly threatening. Don't be fooled by their condition. They've been starved, yes, but only to keep them lean. With the right hand, these animals could bring profit, protection, or entertainment. Who will start the bidding? The crowd hesitated. One farmer spat tobacco juice and muttered, "They look half dead." Another man in a bowler hat asked, "Ain't they dangerous?" Maddox laughed. "Dangerous to those who don't know how to use them, but to the clever, their opportunity." Daniel's jaw clenched. His hand drifted to the badge on his chest. Every instinct screamed to step forward, but he felt the eyes of the town on him. If he intervened, he risked being branded a fool, a sentimental officer unfit to serve. Still, when the larger dog's amber eyes locked with his, Daniel felt the silent plea. It wasn't words, but it was something deeper. He could not ignore it. $10, someone called. Maddox smirked. 10. Do I hear 15? Another voice. 15. The numbers crept up slowly, the bidders half-hearted, as if testing how much the dogs were worth. Maddox's expression tightened. He had expected more. Daniel stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden platform. His voice rang out across the square. "I'll buy them." The auctioneer Maddox turned, amused. "And for how much, officer?" Daniel's answer cut through the murmurs like a blade. "I'll pay whatever it takes. I'll buy them at any price." The square went silent. For a heartbeat, only the wind whistled through the eaves of the saloon and the creak of wagon wheels carried. Then laughter burst out, harsh, mocking. "He's lost his mind," someone jeered. "A cop buying starving curs," another shouted. Maddox's smile widened, sly and poisonous. Briggs strode closer, lowering his voice to Daniel. "Brooks, think about what you're saying. Those dogs are broken. They'll drain you dry, or worse, turn on you." His gray eyes searched Daniel's, a mix of authority and weary concern. Daniel didn't flinch. "They deserve a chance. I won't let them die in cages." Maddox spread his arms theatrically, seizing the moment. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a very generous bidder indeed. Officer Brooks here wishes to pay any price." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "Careful, lawman. You're not just buying dogs, you're buying trouble." The dogs, unaware of the words but sensing the shift in air, pressed closer to the bars. Their eyes, one pair amber, the other dark brown, watched Daniel with a mixture of fear and hope. He could feel the weight of their trust falling onto his shoulders. The choice had been made. He had crossed the line from bystander to savior. The crowd still buzzed, some mocking, some curious, but Daniel stood tall in the gray morning light, his decision unshakable. He would take the dogs. He would face the consequences. For him, the memory of Shadow demanded no less. This was the beginning, the moment when a man who had sworn never to let another animal into his heart risked everything to save two lives no one else wanted. The afternoon sky over Rustwood shifted from gray to a pale wash of sun, but the light did little to soften the heavy mood trailing behind Daniel Brooks as he guided the wagon toward the small police station at the edge of town. The two cages rattled in the back, iron scraping wood with each bump, and inside them, Rex and Duke lay pressed against the bars. They had names. Now names, Daniel whispered to them on the ride, as though bestowing dignity might begin the process of healing. Rex was the larger of the two, his muzzle scarred, his frame lean but still carrying the impression of former strength. Duke was smaller, younger perhaps by a year, his ears pricked high though his body trembled. Both were tethered by chains that had rubbed sores into their fur, their eyes still fierce despite the neglect. Daniel kept glancing back, his heart tightening every time their gazes met. He had promised himself never to bond again, but that vow was already slipping. The Rustwood police station was a squat brick building with two narrow windows facing the dusty road. A flag drooped from its pole, limp in the still air. Sheriff Howard Briggs was waiting outside, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw set like stone. He watched as Daniel stopped the wagon, his frown deepening when he saw the cages. "Damn it, Brooks," Briggs muttered, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of frustration and weary authority. "You actually did it. You really bought them." His gray eyes flicked to the dogs, then back to Daniel. "You just signed yourself a world of trouble." Daniel climbed down slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He stood a head taller than Briggs, but his posture carried respect. "They wouldn't have lasted another week in those cages. You know it." Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice. "These animals are not your responsibility. They're dangerous. I've seen what dogs like that can do. You bring them here, you're putting this whole town at risk." His mustache bristled as he exhaled hard, like a man trying to rein in anger. Daniel tightened his grip on the wagon rail. "They're not dangerous, Sheriff. They're desperate. There's a difference." For a moment, neither spoke, the silence broken only by the soft whimpering of Duke. Briggs's expression hardened, but something like pity flickered in his eyes. "Fine," he said at last. "They're yours. But if anything happens, anything at all, it's your head." With that, Briggs turned on his heel and walked back inside the station, his heavy boots echoing against the wood floor. Inside, Daniel found an empty storage room near the back where he set down the cages. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, but it was quiet, away from the bustle of the main office. He crouched near Rex's cage, speaking softly. "You're safe now, both of you. I'll get you water, food, I promise." The larger dog lifted his head, nostrils flaring as if weighing the sincerity of the words. Duke lay trembling but edged closer, tail brushing the bars once before curling under again. As Daniel unlocked the small hatch to slide in bowls of water, memories broke loose images he'd tried to bury. Shadow, his former partner, filled his thoughts. Shadow had been a massive black and tan German shepherd with unwavering eyes and a steady gait. A dog trained to follow commands, but more importantly, one who had chosen loyalty out of love. Together they'd patrolled countless nights, moving like one body. Until that night in the warehouse, shots fired, darkness broken by muzzle flash, and Shadow lunging between Daniel and the gunman. The bullet meant for Daniel struck the dog's chest. Daniel had cradled him as he bled out, Shadow's eyes still fixed on him with devotion until the light faded. That memory was seared into his soul. It was why Daniel had vowed never to take another dog as partner. He couldn't face that loss again. Yet as Rex and Duke lapped greedily at the water, their ribs heaving with relief, Daniel knew his goal had shifted. He would not let them go to waste. He would not let them die forgotten. Elsewhere in town, Emily Carter adjusted her camera strap as she crossed the main street. Emily was 29, slim with long chestnut hair tied in a low ponytail that escaped in strands around her face. Her green eyes were sharp, always searching, and her notebook was rarely out of reach. She wore a worn leather jacket over a gray blouse, boots scuffed from miles of travel. Emily had grown up in Rustwood but left after high school, chasing stories that mattered, writing for regional newspapers. She'd returned only recently to care for her ailing mother, but her instincts for truth had never dulled. At the fair, she'd watched the auction from the fringes, scribbling furiously as Maddox paraded the K9s like trinkets. She had seen Daniel's outburst, his declaration to buy them at any price, and something inside her had stirred. She knew Maddox's reputation. Too many whispers connected him to darker trade's illegal animal fights. trafficking rare creatures across state lines. Emily's curiosity sharpened into resolve. She wanted the truth, and she wanted the town to see it. That evening, Emily stopped by the Rustwood General Store, a wooden building with shelves stacked high with flour, tools, and bolts of fabric. The owner, Mrs. Lillian Harris, a widow in her 50s with silver hair tied in a bun and eyes perpetually narrowed from suspicion, greeted her with a curt nod. Emily leaned on the counter. "You hear much about Maddox?" she asked casually. Mrs. Harris sniffed. "I hear more than I want to. That man deals in things no good Christian woman would repeat. Brings in wagons at night, leaves before dawn. I've seen crates covered in tarps, too heavy for simple livestock." She lowered her voice. You watch yourself, Emily. Folks who go poking at men like him don't always come back the same. Emily jotted the words down. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. I'll be careful." But as she stepped back into the chill evening air, her pulse quickened. A story was here, bigger than she'd expected. Back at the station, Daniel spread an old blanket on the floor of the storage room and one at a time coaxed Rex and Duke out of their cages. At first they resisted, teeth bared in low growls, but Daniel sat cross-legged, patient, speaking softly. "It's all right. You're free now." He set out small portions of meat from his own lunch ration. Hunger won over fear. Duke crept forward first, snatching the food before retreating, while Rex held back, eyes sharp. Finally, with a low rumble, the larger dog stepped out, towering over Daniel but too weak to stand long. He sank onto the blanket, chewing with slow determination. Daniel stroked a hand over Rex's neck, feeling the jut of bones under matted fur. "You were warriors once. You still are. I'll make sure you remember that." His voice was thick, almost a vow. Sheriff Briggs appeared at the doorway, arms folded. He watched for a long moment, then said, "You're wasting your time, Brooks. Dogs like that, once they've been broken, they don't come back." His voice held bitterness, a shadow of his brother's injury. But Daniel looked up, eyes fierce. "Then I'll prove you wrong." The sheriff grunted, unwilling to argue further. "You want them? They're your burden. But don't bring the town into it. Keep them under control or I'll have no choice but to step in." He left, boots echoing down the hall. Alone again, Daniel leaned back against the wall, exhaustion setting in. Yet beneath it was a spark he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. These dogs would not be merchandise. They would not be forgotten. He would train them, restore them, and prove to everyone, including himself, that redemption was possible. And across town, Emily Carter lit a lamp in her small rented room above the tailor's shop, spreading her notes across the desk. She circled Maddox's name again and again. The fare was only the surface. Behind it lay a network of cruelty, and she intended to uncover it. She didn't yet know that her path and Daniel's were on a collision course, but destiny was already weaving their stories together. Morning came with a heavy fog that wrapped Rustwood in a gray shroud, muting the usual color of shop fronts and wooden porches. The church bell tolled lazily, echoing through the narrow streets where townsfolk gathered in clusters, their voices hushed but sharp with judgment. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Officer Daniel Brooks had taken in 2 half-dead K9 dogs from Cole Maddox's auction. Some said he was brave, others said foolish, but nearly everyone had an opinion. Daniel rose early, boots crunching on the frost-coated ground as he walked into the storage room where Rex and Duke were curled together. They had eaten better the night before than in weeks, their eyes brighter now, though their frames still thin. Rex stretched stiffly, scarred muzzle lifting to scent the air, while Duke's ears flicked at the sound of boots. Daniel knelt, sliding fresh water into their bowls, his movements slow and deliberate. The bond was forming, he could feel it. But outside these walls, that bond was a source of trouble. The Rustwood Town Hall, a squat building with faded white paint and tall windows, was buzzing that morning. Inside, townsfolk filled the benches, faces tense. At the front sat Mayor Franklin Ward, a heavy-set man in his early 60s, his hair thinning at the crown, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. Ward was a man who preferred peace at any cost, more politician than leader, but the town trusted him because he rarely strayed from what the majority wanted. His plump hands tapped the gavel nervously as the meeting was called to order. Sheriff Howard Briggs stood beside the mayor, arms crossed, mustache twitching as if annoyed simply to be present. "You all know why we're here," Briggs announced. Officer Brooks has brought 2 former police K9s into town. Some of you are concerned. Let's hear it plain. The first to rise was Thomas Keene, a farmer in his 40s with weather-beaten skin, wide shoulders, and a permanent scowl carved by years of hardship. He had a young daughter who had once been bitten by a stray mutt, an accident that left her with a scar on her leg. That memory made his tone bitter. "We can't have half-wild animals in our town," Keene growled. "They've been trained for violence and now they're broken. That's a recipe for disaster. I won't risk my family." Others nodded. Clara Higgins, the schoolteacher, a thin woman with steel-gray hair pinned into a tight bun and sharp eyes behind wire spectacles, raised her voice next. "Children walk these streets every day. You think parents will rest easy knowing those beasts are just down the road? If they snap, it'll be too late." Clara's husband had died of fever years before, leaving her with a cold practicality that brooked no foolishness. She was respected, and her words carried weight. The murmurs swelled until Mayor Ward tapped his gavel again. "Quiet now. Sheriff Briggs, what say you?" Briggs's voice was steady, pragmatic. "I didn't agree with Brooks bringing them here. But he did. Legally, they're his. Still, the law also demands public safety. I've asked him to prepare a report showing those animals aren't a threat. If he can't, then we'll have to consider stronger measures." The crowd murmured approval. The pressure was mounting. Meanwhile, back at the station, Daniel scribbled notes at his desk. His pen moved slowly, frustration clear in the deep furrows of his brow. "Document progress," he muttered. "Evidence of control." He sighed. Proving the value of Rex and Duke wouldn't come from words. It would take time, trust, and action. Time the town might not grant. That afternoon, Daniel led Rex and Duke into the fenced yard behind the station. Both wore heavy collars and short leads. They moved hesitantly, sniffing at the frost-laden grass, tails low but wagging faintly. A few curious townsfolk had gathered along the fence, whispering. Among them was Henry Cole, a wiry farmhand with straw-blonde hair and restless hands. He leaned on the fence, his voice mocking. "They don't look so tough now, do they?" He reached a hand through the bars before Daniel could stop him. Rex lunged, teeth flashing in a blur, snapping inches from Henry's hand. Duke barked sharply, pulling against his leash. The crowd gasped, voices rising in panic. Henry stumbled back, pale as milk. "You saw that! He tried to tear my hand clean off!" Daniel yanked Rex back, commanding firmly, "Sit! Down!" Rex hesitated, body taut, then sank reluctantly onto his haunches, growl fading into a whine. Duke mirrored the motion, confused but obedient. Daniel's voice dropped, steady and calm. They reacted to a stranger reaching in, nothing more. Any animal would. But the damage was done. Clara Higgins clutched her shawl tighter, her face pinched with fear. Thomas Keene barked, "This is what I warned you about!" The whispers turned to angry muttering, and the crowd dispersed with dark looks. Sheriff Briggs appeared at Daniel's side, his jaw clenched. "That was too close. You see what I'm up against now? Folks want them gone, Brooks. You've got to understand that." Daniel's shoulders sagged. He looked at Rex, still trembling but holding his gaze with amber eyes. "They just need time," Daniel murmured. "I can prove they're not dangerous. I have to." That night, Daniel sat in the dim storage room again, the dogs resting nearby. He thought of Shadow, of the night in the warehouse. The guilt twisted his insides. Was he trying to save Rex and Duke, or was he trying to rewrite the past? His hands rubbed his face as he whispered, "Am I wrong about you? Am I making the same mistake all over again?" Rex shifted closer, resting his head against the bars as though answering in silence. Across town, in the glow of a kerosene lamp, Emily Carter tapped her pencil against her notebook. She had spoken to a contact in the next county, a fellow reporter who whispered of similar auctions dogs, exotic animals, even big cats traded in secret. Her instincts told her Maddox was only a piece of a larger puzzle. She scribbled a headline idea. "Trafficking in plain sight, the dark trade in Rustwood's shadow." The public outrage over Daniel's dogs would be the perfect entry point for exposing the network. Emily's mother, Margaret Carter, called softly from the next room. Margaret was in her late 50s, her frame frail from a lingering illness that stole her breath on cold nights. She had once been a lively seamstress, but years of struggle had left her gentler, slower. "Emily, you're working too late again," she said, voice rasping. Emily entered the room, squeezing her mother's hand. "I'm fine, Mama. Just following a lead." Margaret studied her with faded blue eyes that still held warmth. You're stubborn, just like your father was. But be careful. Some truths cut deep. Emily kissed her cheek. I know, but someone has to tell it. Back at the station, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked the darkened yard, the cold air biting his lungs. He replayed the moment Rex had lunged, the fear on the crowd's faces. Was Briggs right? Was the town right? If Rex or Duke ever hurt someone, it would confirm every fear. He stopped, staring at the faint glow of the lantern inside the storage room. He whispered to himself, No, I won't give up on them. Not like this. In the quiet night, the dogs stirred, their eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. Two broken creatures clinging to survival, two chances at redemption, for them and perhaps for him. The weight of the town's judgment pressed heavy, but Daniel felt a fire kindling inside. He would not abandon them. He would find a way to prove their worth, even if the whole of Rustwood stood against him. The winter wind came down from the hills in cutting gusts, rattling the shutters of Rustwood's small police station and carrying with it the scent of smoke from 100 chimneys. By late afternoon, the streets were slick with frozen mud, lanterns glowing early against the gathering dark. Daniel Brooks was at his desk, papers spread before him, the beginnings of the safety report that Sheriff Briggs demanded. His pen scratched slowly, though his thoughts were elsewhere, on the two dogs resting in the storage room, and on the town that seemed to be watching his every move with suspicion. A knock at the door drew him from his writing. It opened before he could answer, revealing Emily Carter. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, her notebook clutched tight. She looked different from when he'd last glimpsed her at the auction, more determined, her green eyes blazing with the kind of fire only a lead story could ignite. Her jacket was dusted with frost, and strands of chestnut hair escaped her ponytail, clinging damp to her face. Officer Brooks, she said, closing the door behind her. We need to talk. And it's not small talk. Daniel leaned back, eyeing her warily. You're the reporter, Emily Carter, right? I've heard you're asking a lot of questions. Emily set her notebook on the desk and opened it to reveal sketches and copied notes. Questions that have answers you need to hear. Cole Maddox isn't just some low-life animal trader, he's the center of a pipeline. Dogs like Rex and Duke are taken from police programs after they're declared unfit or retired. Maddox buys them cheap, starves them, and then sells them to crime syndicates. They're used for blood sport, fights staged in basements and barns, sometimes even for intimidation and gang disputes. She tapped the page with her pencil, her voice tight. I have contacts in 2 counties who've seen the shipments. It's all connected back to him. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had suspected Maddox was filth, but this made his blood run hot. Why bring this to me? Why not to Sheriff Briggs? Emily's lips curled bitterly. Because Briggs wants peace. He'd rather sweep trouble under the rug than pick a fight he might not win. You already made a stand. You're the only one who won't look the other way. For a moment, Daniel said nothing, only rubbed at the scar on his chin, a habit when he was weighing heavy truths. Then his voice was low, resolute. If what you're saying is true, Maddox won't stop until he gets them back. He's invested too much. Emily nodded. That's why I'm warning you. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft whine. Rex had risen from his blanket, pressing against the bars as if sensing the tension. His amber eyes never left Daniel, steady and unyielding. Duke followed, ears pricked, tail twitching nervously. Emily's gaze softened at the sight. They know, she whispered. Animals always do. That night, Daniel decided he could not keep the dogs at the station where anyone might slip in. He loaded them into the back of his old pickup, an aging Ford with rust along the fenders, and drove them out to his small ranch on the outskirts of town. The land had once belonged to his father, a modest house of weathered clapboard, a barn with sagging doors, and pasture overgrown with winter weeds. The night air bit hard, stars sharp in the black sky. He guided Rex and Duke into the barn where he had prepared blankets and bowls. The place smelled of hay and leather, familiar and safe. He crouched low, unclipped their chains, and let them explore. Rex padded forward first, sniffing every corner, his scarred muzzle twitching. Duke stayed closer, occasionally brushing Daniel's leg with his flank. Home, Daniel murmured, at least for now. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose shingles on the roof, but inside the barn was warmth and quiet. Daniel rolled out a bedroll for himself in one of the empty stalls. He couldn't explain why, but he felt more at ease near them than alone in his own house. He drifted into uneasy sleep, the dogs lying close, their breathing steady. Sometime past midnight, a sound woke him. Not the wind, but the crunch of boots on frozen soil. Daniel's eyes snapped open, instincts kicking in. He reached for the rifle propped against the stall. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, he saw shadows moving outside the barn. Cole Maddox had sent his men. There were 3 of them, rough-looking drifters, faces hidden beneath scarves, pistols at their hips. One carried a crowbar, the other a length of chain. They moved with the assurance of men who had done this before. Daniel whispered sharply, "Stay," though the dogs were already bristling. Rex rose with a low, rumbling growl, teeth bared, his entire frame taut. Duke followed, lips curling back, hackles raised. The barn door creaked as the first man pushed it open. His lantern spilled light across the floor. "Easy money," he muttered. "Grab the mutts. Let's go." Daniel stepped out from the stall, rifle raised. "Not tonight." The men froze, startled but quickly recovering. "You're outnumbered, lawman," one sneered. "Hand him over and no one gets hurt." But before Daniel could answer, Rex lunged forward, planting himself between Daniel and the intruders, teeth flashing in the lantern light. Duke joined him, smaller but no less fierce, barking sharply. Their growls filled the barn, echoing off wooden beams. The intruders hesitated. One raised his chain threateningly. "Call them off or I'll gut them right here." Daniel's heart pounded, but pride surged too. These weren't half-dead creatures anymore, they were protectors. "You'll have to get through them first," he said flatly. The standoff stretched taut. Then the leader spat on the ground. "Ain't worth it tonight. We'll be back." He jerked his head, and the men retreated into the dark, their boots fading into silence. Daniel lowered his rifle slowly, exhaling. Rex and Duke stayed at his side, growls fading only when the night settled again. He crouched, running a hand over Rex's coarse fur, then Duke's. "Good boys," he whispered, his throat tight. "You stood your ground." The realization hit him hard. They weren't just surviving anymore. They had chosen to defend him, to trust him. In that moment, Daniel wasn't just their rescuer. He was their leader, their pack. Outside, the cold stars burned silent witness. Inside the barn, 3 lives had crossed an invisible threshold. The following evening brought with it an eerie stillness over Rustwood, as if the town itself sensed what was coming. Clouds hung low, swollen with snow, and the lanterns burning in the street flickered nervously in the chill wind. Daniel Brooks stood in the small yard behind the police station, watching Rex and Duke pace within the fenced enclosure he had built hastily with scrap wood and wire. They had grown stronger since the night at the ranch. Rex's scarred muzzle looked almost regal under the moonlight, his amber eyes sharp with vigilance. Duke, though younger and leaner, moved with a restless energy, his bark quick and cutting. They had become more than survivors. They were guardians, and they knew trouble was near. Inside the station, Sheriff Howard Briggs sat behind his desk, a ledger open in front of him but ignored. The older man's brow was furrowed so deeply that the wrinkles seemed carved in stone. He had always been a man of order, but tonight order felt like a fragile rope fraying under weight. He tugged at his gray mustache and muttered, "The law says one thing, the people demand another, but if Maddox comes for those dogs, it'll be war on our doorstep." His voice was quiet, but his deputy, Earl Whitman, heard every word. Earl was in his mid-30s, slim and wiry, with sandy blonde hair cropped close and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his gun belt. He wasn't as seasoned as Briggs or Daniel, but his heart was steady. Earl had lost his older brother to a gang skirmish years ago, and that wound made him fiercely loyal to protecting Rustwood, though sometimes fear crept into his eyes when he spoke of violence. "You think Maddox will make his move tonight?" Earl asked, glancing toward the barred windows. Briggs grunted. "I'd bet my badge on it. Men like him don't like being embarrassed." Brooks shamed him at that auction, then beat back his hired thugs at the ranch. "Maddox won't rest until he's got those dogs a revenge." The words proved prophetic. As dusk deepened into night, the rumble of horses and the crunch of boots echoed from the main street. Daniel stiffened as he caught sight of shadows moving like a tide. Cole Maddox had arrived. Maddox rode at the front astride a dark bay horse, his slicked-back hair gleaming with oil under the lanterns he and his men carried. His fine brown coat flapped in the cold, his boots polished, but his face was drawn tight with venom. Behind him, Nearly a dozen armed men fanned out, rough hands clutching rifles, revolvers glinting. They spread in a half circle around the station, their formation practiced. The townsfolk peeked nervously from shuttered windows, whispers darting through the cold air. Maddox's voice cut across the night. "Sheriff, Brooks, you've got property that belongs to me. Hand over the dogs and we walk away. Refuse, and this little station won't see morning light." Sheriff Briggs stepped onto the porch, his heavy frame backlit by the glow of a lantern. He rested one hand on the railing, the other hovering near his holster. "Maddox, those animals aren't property. You lost them fair and square." Maddox sneered, his pale eyes narrowing. "Don't preach law to me. I've bought sheriffs and judges before. Those dogs are mine and I intend to collect." He raised his hand. His men cocked their weapons in unison. Daniel appeared beside Briggs, Rex, and Duke, straining against their leashes at his side. His eyes were cold, voice steady. "You'll have to go through us." The standoff stretched long, the night holding its breath. Then a new voice broke the silence. "The whole country's going to see what happens here." It was Emily Carter, standing across the street with a small handheld camera balanced on a tripod, her breath fogging in the cold. She wore her worn leather jacket buttoned tight, her face pale but resolute. She had always been small in frame, but tonight her presence was immense. "This is live," she declared loudly. "Every word, every bullet, it's going out on the wire. Maddox, you fire a shot, the world will know what kind of man you are." Maddox's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You think I care about an audience, little reporter? All they'll see is a sheriff and his rogue deputy gunned down for harboring dangerous beasts." His hand dropped sharply. "Open fire!" Gunfire erupted like thunder. Bullets shattered the wooden porch posts, glass splintered, the air filled with smoke and chaos. Daniel pushed Briggs back inside the station, slamming the door as Rex and Duke barked furiously. Earl Whitman dove for cover, drawing his revolver with shaking hands. Daniel crouched low, rifle in hand. "Rex, Duke, stay close." But the dogs had no intention of hiding. When the door cracked open under the battering of Maddox's men, Rex lunged, a blur of teeth and muscle, hurling himself at the first intruder. Duke followed, snapping at ankles, driving the attackers back. For a moment, their ferocity turned the tide. Emily, crouched behind a water trough, kept her camera steady. The feed flickered but held, capturing the storm of violence, dogs fighting alongside men, lawmen pinned down by gunfire, Maddox barking orders like a general. Her heart pounded, but she whispered to herself, "They have to see this. They have to know." Inside, Sheriff Briggs fired from the window, his revolver booming. For all his gruff words, the old man fought with the precision of long years. Earl, despite his trembling, picked off a gunman with a lucky shot, eyes wide with shock at his own accuracy. But the numbers were against them. Maddox's men closed in, their bullets tearing chunks from the station's facade. Daniel returned fire, but a shot found his shoulder, spinning him against the wall. Pain seared hot, blood soaking his uniform. He gasped, his rifle slipping. The world tilted. For a heartbeat he thought it might end there, that Shadow's sacrifice would be in vain, and these two new lives would be lost with him. Maddox strode forward through the smoke, pistol raised, his voice dripping triumph. "Told you, lawman, you can't win against me." But before the trigger pulled, a blur of motion cut him short. Rex, once dismissed as broken, launched himself with a savage snarl. His jaws clamped onto Maddox's arm, twisting, dragging him down into the dirt. Maddox screamed, his pistol clattering away. Duke was there in an instant, snapping and forcing Maddox to the ground. Daniel, vision blurred by pain, forced himself upright, rifle in his good hand. "Hold!" he shouted, voice ragged but commanding. For a moment silence fell, the battle suspended. Maddox writhed beneath the weight of the dogs, his polished coat torn, his smug composure shattered. Emily zoomed her lens in, her voice trembling but clear as she narrated. "The dogs he called worthless just saved the officer he tried to kill. Everyone is seeing this, the truth in Rustwood." Sheriff Briggs emerged onto the porch, revolver aimed squarely at Maddox. His voice was low, cold. "It's over, Cole. Call your men off before they end up the same." The mercenaries, seeing their leader pinned, faltered. Some dropped their guns, others melted back into the night. The sudden retreat left Maddox alone, his breath ragged, eyes wild as Rex's teeth held him fast. Daniel staggered forward, resting his good hand on Rex's neck. "Easy, boy. You've done enough." Reluctantly, Rex released, though his amber eyes stayed fixed on Maddox with a predator's promise. Bloodied, humiliated, Cole Maddox lay gasping in the dirt while Emily's camera broadcasted the image to countless screens across the country. For once, Rustwood's little station wasn't just defending itself, it had become the center of a storm, and in that storm, two broken dogs had chosen their leader, proving their worth in a way no report or argument ever could. Snow fell thick over Rustwood in the days that followed the gunfight, muffling the town under a blanket of silence. What had once been an isolated dispute between a sheriff, a deputy, and a determined officer had turned into a story carried across the nation. Lanterns glowed warm in the frosted windows, but the town's heart was unsettled, waiting for the fallout of what had transpired. Cole Maddox sat in a cell inside the county jail, his fine coat shredded, his slick hair greasy and unkempt. The once arrogant gleam in his pale eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow rage. His arm was bandaged poorly, teeth marks from Rex still vivid through the cloth. He muttered under his breath, cursing Daniel Brooks, cursing the town, cursing the very idea that dogs could undo him. Sheriff Howard Briggs stood outside the cell with his deputy Earl Whitman, both men watching the prisoner closely. Briggs had regained the gruff calm that defined him, but there was something different in his gaze, a grudging respect for the officer who had refused to yield. "Funny thing," Briggs said, mustache twitching. "Law says a man like him will get his day in court, but everyone watching already saw his trial play out live." Earl, still pale from the memory of bullets flying, shifted uncomfortably. "And the whole world saw two dogs save this town." His voice carried wonder, as though he still couldn't quite believe it. Daniel Brooks, his arm bound in fresh bandages, entered the room slowly. His step was steady despite the pain, his gray-blue eyes fixed on Maddox. He looked weary, but beneath that weariness was a quiet strength, the look of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Rex patted at his heel, his scarred muzzle lifted with pride, while Duke trotted close behind, tail swishing cautiously. The dogs had been cleaned, their coats brushed, their ribs no longer standing out so sharply. They looked like themselves again, not merchandise, not cast-offs, but guardians. Maddox spat at the floor. "Enjoy your victory, Brooks. You think you've killed my trade? There are others, bigger men. I was just one piece." His voice cracked with bitterness. Daniel's reply was even. "Then you'll be remembered as the piece that broke first. The law will take care of the rest." He turned away, his hand brushing Rex's head in a gesture of reassurance. The following week saw a storm of lawmen arrive from neighboring counties. Marshal Leonard Hale, a tall man in his 50s with a hawk-like face and a reputation for being relentless against organized crime, rode into Rustwood with 3 deputies. Hale wore a long gray coat dusted with snow, a black Stetson pulled low, and his voice carried the clipped authority of someone used to obedience. He wasted no time. "Maddox's records, his men, his shipments, we'll track every last one. This ring won't trouble you again." Briggs, standing with arms crossed, muttered, "About time." But there was relief in his eyes as Hale's men loaded confiscated crates onto wagons. Inside were files, ledgers, and even the remnants of Animal Cage's evidence that stretched far beyond Rustwood. Emily Carter was there too, scribbling furiously in her notebook, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She had not only filmed the gunfight, but had begun piecing together the full picture of Maddox's empire. Her green eyes glimmered as she interviewed Hale, pressing for quotes. "Do you believe this case will lead to further indictments across the state?" she asked. Hale grunted, but answered, "It'll lead to a message. The days of trafficking animals like disposable goods are numbered." Emily's pen scratched quickly across the paper, her heart pounding. This was bigger than a local story. This was a national headline. By spring, the snow melted from the hills, and with it melted the doubts of Rustwood's people. At first, they had whispered of danger, of beasts unfit to be kept within town. Now they spoke with admiration. Children ran to the fence of the station yard to watch Rex and Duke train with Daniel, their laughter chasing away the fear that had once choked the air. Farmers who had demanded the dogs be removed now nodded respectfully when they passed, tipping hats as if acknowledging protectors. Clara Higgins, the strict schoolteacher who once railed against them, even brought her students to the yard one morning. She stood stiff-backed as always, her bun wound tightly, but her sharp voice softened when she said, "Children, these are examples of loyalty and courage. Remember that." She gave Daniel a quick nod, a silent apology wrapped in pride. For Daniel, the change was slow but powerful. Each day he trained Rex and Duke, their bodies growing stronger, their obedience sharpening, their eyes watching him with trust. They were no longer broken. They were partners. And with every command followed, with every protective bark, Daniel felt the weight of his past with shadow ease. The guilt never vanished, but it transformed into something else: resolve. Shadow's sacrifice had not ended with grief. It had opened the path to this second chance. On a warm evening, Emily visited the ranch where Daniel had brought the dogs for exercise. She carried a folded newspaper in her satchel, her steps quick, her face bright. "It's out," she said, handing him the copy. The headline blazed: "Two dogs that changed a town, Rustwood stand against cruelty." Her byline glowed beneath it, and inside was her account, detailed, heartfelt, and unflinching. The article spread across the country, shared by big city papers and whispered in sheriff's offices across distant counties. For once, Rustwood was not just a quiet town on the frontier. It was a symbol of defiance, of compassion, of the bond between man and animal. Daniel read the lines slowly, the dogs lying at his feet. Emily stood nearby, waiting. When he finished, he looked up with a rare smile, the first true smile she had seen in him. "You didn't just write about them," he said softly. "You wrote about hope." Emily shrugged, though her eyes shimmered. Maybe we both needed reminding. In the weeks that followed, Rex and Duke were officially sworn in as part of Rustwood's force. Sheriff Briggs himself presided over the modest ceremony in front of the station, his deep voice carrying across the gathered crowd. The dogs wore polished harnesses with badges fixed at the side, their ears pricked, their stance proud. "Rustwood has new guardians," Briggs declared, "and they've already proved themselves truer than most men I've met." The applause that followed was genuine, unreserved. Daniel stood with his dogs at his side, his bandaged shoulder healed enough that he could stand tall again. For the first time in years, he felt the ache in his chest loosen. He wasn't just saving them. They had saved him from loneliness, from guilt, from the shadows of the past. That night, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Daniel sat on the porch of his father's ranch, coffee mug warming his hands. Rex lay at his feet, eyes half closed, while Duke sprawled in the grass, gnawing a stick with youthful energy. Emily had stopped by, sitting on the porch rail, her laughter soft as she shared stories of her late father, who had once told her to write for those who cannot speak. She realized now, she said, those words had led her here. Daniel looked out across the fading light, a quiet smile on his lips. He thought of Shadow, of debts paid, of lives redeemed. He thought of the town that had turned doubt into respect, and of the two dogs who had walked with him out of despair into purpose. He whispered to himself, "We made it." The wind stirred gently, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in 15 years, Daniel Brooks felt whole. At the end of this story, there is a quiet lesson worth carrying into our daily lives. Sometimes what the world calls broken, useless, or dangerous is only waiting for a second chance. Daniel, Rex, and Duke remind us that loyalty, courage, and love can appear where many have given up hope. In our own lives, it may be a neighbor who needs understanding, a family member who needs forgiveness, or even a stray animal that simply needs kindness. Choosing compassion over fear can change more than one life. It can change a community. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who could use a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and if you feel moved, type Amen as a way of standing with Daniel, Rex, and Duke in spirit. Subscribe to the channel to join us for more stories that carry light into dark places. May God bless you and your family, and may He guide us all to see the value in every living soul.